Malloy is our Capital Bureau Chief. He has the distinct pleasure of sharing his intellect, his questioning, his wealth of knowledge, I'll cut off there, with our distinguished panel from right to left, Governor Dannel P. Malloy, CBIA CEO Joe Brennan, and CEO of MetroHartford Alliance, Oz Griebel. Thank you all for joining us today.
Since we're here in part because CBIA and some other groups have started this 20 by 17 campaign of trying to get Connecticut to be a top 20 business state by 2017. Really, Joe? And so because that's sort of the framework for this, I want to start this by just asking each of you, what is the best metric for where the state is as far as its business climate? Governor Malloy always stresses he's a benchmark kind of guy. If you look at the CNBC ratings that CBIA has pointed to, one of the interesting ones is that Connecticut is in the middle of the pack for business friendliness. We are 25, but we're a very high cost state. So anyway, let's start it there. What's the most reasonable metric to use to say where Connecticut is as far as its business climate?
Is that for any of us? You want me to
For
start?
any of it. And I can't believe the governor's running back.
Well, I think it's hard to say that just one mark, but I think, if you look at gross state product, if you just see the overall growth in the economy, whether it's a national economy or a state economy, I think that's really, really important. Obviously, you can't overlook jobs either, job creation. Now, a lot goes into that. Jobs numbers sometimes can be deceiving. You have to look at the types of jobs you're creating. There's always churning in an economy. Are you losing really good jobs and then filling those with lower paying jobs? That stuff's not always readily apparent. But I think if you look at the CNBC rankings, one of the ones where we haven't performed well over the long term is what they call their economy ranking, where they do look at gross state product and a lot of other factors. So, what we tried to do, and I should mention Oz is on the steering committee of the 20 by 17 campaign too. But what we tried to do is really leverage those areas where we're strong, because Connecticut, as we all know, has a lot of strengths. I mean, I hate to even say the words that CNBC says we're 46, because I think we all feel Connecticut is a lot better than that. But we have to leverage our strengths around our education, our workforce, our quality of life, the world-class companies we already have here, the great location we have. There's so much to offer here, but we have to acknowledge those areas where we're not strong, whether it's cost of doing business, our transportation infrastructure, which I'm sure the governor will talk about tonight, and some of those other things. So, but I think if we can just see gross state product growing and then the jobs following that, that might be the best metric we can look at right over the short term.
Just a quick, jobs I think are the end all and the be all. Recovery of the jobs we lost in this current case in 2008 and trying to have a number that goes past that. And the related number to Joe's point about quality of jobs, personal income is an indicator of that. We've been stagnant more or less in the 2.5% to 3% range as opposed to the 5% range that we enjoy back there. I think those two things are simply that are indicative of anything else you're doing over the longer term.
I think any number of things go in. I think some of these things tend to be more subjective, representing some of these rankings, representing the values that someone associates with being a good state for business. But listen, in 12th grade reading, mathematics, and writing, we're #1 in the country. We have the second lowest effective corporate tax rate in the country. But in some of these things, on the business side, they count against us that we have an estate tax. Go figure. Doesn't have a whole lot to do with business. So I think that they're not the most objective rankings in the world. We're in the top 5 healthiest states in the nation. Educational outcomes, top 5 routinely, not just 12th grade, but overall. So I think there are things that we're very good at, including the second lowest effective corporate tax rate in the country. On the other hand, we've got to do better at a lot of things. And I think that some of the problems are that we didn't fall in these rankings overnight. We're not going to climb ourselves out of it, although I believe that we are effectively making progress by taking on things like the size of government and the growth of government, and making some real changes there, trying to hold down the ability of government to expand as fast as some people would like it to do. I'm certainly arguing and holding us to a lower growth rate in government. In fact, there are fewer state employees now in state government than there were the day I was sworn in. And obviously we're involved in a fight over some of those issues at the Capitol. But, you know, I think we're going to get a budget done. We're going to allow us to continue to make progress. Listen, we have one of the lower poverty rates. We have one of the highest health insured rates in the country. We've implemented some new standards quite effectively in holding ourselves responsible for even greater educational outcomes, particularly in our urban environments. We need to make progress across the board.
So what's the Malloy ranking for where Connecticut is? I think probably people in this community would love to know, how does our governor see the extent of the challenge before the state as far as improving the business climate? So what's the Malloy number?
Well, I will point out a great deficit item in most of these quote-unquote business rankings, and that is we have a very high property tax. So we have the second lowest effective corporate tax rate in the nation. But we have routinely in the top 3 property tax rates, and I would argue that we're probably effectively more reliant, at least for local government, on property taxes than any other state. So then when you apply that across the board, and you understand the communities in which large businesses are operating, like Hartford, where you have a 77 mill rate, that's going to have an impact. I think we need to ultimately make progress in taking on the issue of our over-reliance on property taxes. I think it's probably the single biggest negative that we have on a lot of these rankings when you look at them, or it's one of the biggest, certainly one of the top 5 across the board, and it's some of the biggest. So I think we need to make progress on that, and that's certainly something that we've worked on in tandem with our desire to improve educational outcomes.
And people do pay, it's almost twice as much in property taxes. Out of the state as a whole, there's twice as much paid property taxes and income taxes. So yeah, that is a huge factor. Joe and Oz, are you playing defense this year, or are you playing offense? Is this a year where you're going to make progress on business climate, or because of the continued fiscal situation, is the goal not to lose ground?
Yeah, if you asked me 2 weeks ago, I may have had a different answer, but with the budget that came out of the Appropriations Committee 2 weeks ago yesterday, I believe, and the tax bill that came out of the Finance Committee 2 weeks ago tomorrow, that really, I think, really did change the game. Change the game quite a bit. We were trying to advance a positive agenda. I've been saying all along since I took over at CBIA, I think Connecticut has enormous economic potential. And I don't want to just say we want to be top 20. I think we could be a top 10 or a top 5 state. I think we could be a destination state where companies want to come and be here. But we've got to make smart policy choices in order to get there. And we were trying to advance a lot of those things. But now, it's almost 100% defense right now just because of the enormity of the tax increase and the evisceration of the spending cap that happened 2 weeks ago. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm still optimistic. I mean, it's hard to be optimistic over the short term here because the budget is not going to be something we like ultimately. I can say in front of the governor, we came out pretty strong against some of the tax proposals that he put forward back in February. Right now they look wonderful compared to what we're seeing. But, so it's a tough session. I can't say that we're going to come out great. The rankings, these things lag time, so we're not going to, see progress for a while. If it was just CNBC, Mark, I think, we could just ignore that or say it's failed methodology. The problem is that it's almost incessant. There was one that I just almost laughed at last week that came out and said we're 33rd for aerospace manufacturing in the country, and 50th when it comes to business climate for aerospace manufacturing. I mean, that's like a bedrock of our economy and something that we're putting a lot of resources in and that have great potential for job growth. So you have to, look at these things with a little bit of a prism, but the fact is there's so many of them out there that business people look at, and it just makes it harder, I think, to attract investment. And just one other point, I'm not just saying this because the governor's here, because I've said this publicly in other meetings, but we're talking about progress, and, we did gain between 25,000 and 26,000 jobs last year, which was the biggest we've seen since 2000, whatever.
1998.
1998. And again, I'm not, saying this because the governor's here, but I do believe this, that some of the major initiatives that we've worked on together, his administration and the business community, were not solely, certainly, or maybe even primarily driven by the economy. But when you look at education, I think the reason for that was to give every kid, regardless of their socioeconomic status, a good education. But I think the government also realized that talent development and workforce is huge for our economic future. So that was a major reason for that. And you look at energy, comprehensive energy strategy, same thing. You want everybody to have reliable, clean, affordable energy, but I think a lot of it was driven by economic reasons, because our manufacturers pay such high costs for energy. So we made progress there. And I think even transportation, there's a lot of reasons to reform transportation, but I think a lot of that is driven by concerns over our economy. So we're making progress. It's just when things like what just happened a couple weeks ago, and regardless of how the budget comes out, even having those things public, again, casts a pall on Connecticut, I think, nationally, as far as a good place to do business. So we just want to keep that forward progress. Are we going to hit top 20 by 17 right now? Probably not, but let's get it by 18 or 19. It's all about making progress and making Connecticut the state we all want it to be.
Just a quick response, Mark. I mean, confidence is at the bedrock of what anybody makes decisions on. Whether you're making decisions on the political future of the state, or you're making a decision whether to invest in the state for capital purposes or expand jobs. And I think to answer your question, we're on defense, and that the signal that particularly the Appropriations and Finance budget came out with sends I think a horrific signal to the private sector in terms of their confidence that there's going to be a steady state in terms of the way the state is governed from a fiscal standpoint. We applaud the governor's statement on February 18th and his subsequent statements that the spending cap is something he intends to adhere to. We can only say rah-rah, because we think it's important that there be a strong signal set. As difficult as it is to adhere to that cap in the governor's budget, yes, we may not like some of the tax issues, components of that, but there were spending cuts, meaningful spending cuts to try to get things under control. And if we're going to have a debate on the spending cap, and there are many, maybe even in this room, who think we should, let's have that debate outside the context of trying to decide a budget and play the kind of games that I think send an awful signal to the private sector in terms of predictability and having confidence that they can make investments in a way that they understand what the long-term tax and fiscal structure will be in the state.
Let me point out a few things about the long-term nature of what we need to do. When I came into office, not having served in state government previously, we had one of the top 5 worst funded pension plans in the United States. That happened over a 20-year period of time. We had no money set aside, effectively no money, no more than a few $100,000, set aside for OPEB, other post-employment benefit requirements. That's a situation that had existed even when the state government was putting pressure on municipalities to comply with gap financing responsibilities. There was no discipline in the state of Connecticut under Republican governors and Democratic legislators, or however you want to divide it. This thing happened over a long period of time. We were the proverbial, frog in a pan on the stove. The water was cold when the fire first came on, and before you knew it, you were cooked. And so, and to Joe's point, we're still dealing with rankings that are pre-12 numbers in some cases, or 12 at best. So you're ranking things based on where we were in the past. And then, quite frankly, there are other things that and I think Joe's right. We understood education's a problem. That's why we've increased graduation rates from high school by 5.3% in 4 years. The fastest growing increase in the country, and diplomas that mean more than they did 4 years ago, quite frankly, but it's holding people accountable. On the job training, we're putting more money into job training. We're effectively making sure that we catch up on the preparation of a replacement workforce, something that nobody had paid any attention to. And there was a survey of small businesses across the country that indicate that their number one problem right now in the United States is hiring, self-described by small businesses, is hiring a workforce capable of doing the work that they actually have available. We're doing things on those fronts. Likewise, making sure that our universities, and particularly our community college system, is responding to the needs of small businesses and large employers both, is extremely important. We weren't doing it. We had an educational system that didn't see that as part of their mission. Their mission was to grant as many liberal art degrees as they could, with some specialty degrees, and let the private sector be damned. I think we have a very different relationship now, but it's going to take a long time to turn it around. Final point, transportation. Listen, we have underinvested in transportation for 2 generations in this state. That's where we are. You want to understand why you can't move through, why it takes me 2 hours to get to Stanford in the morning? It's because we underinvested in transportation, in rail, in bus, in highways, in bridges, and alternatives. And so we need to build that system, and that's going to take even longer in some senses to catch up because we underinvested compared to Massachusetts, compared to Rhode Island, compared to New York, compared to New Jersey. New Jersey built a parallel highway system while we debated whether we were going to redesign exits.
Governor, going forward with the budget, you've achieved one miracle this year. You've gotten the Democrats and the Republicans in the legislature to agree that their cuts were too deep, that they hit the social safety net a bit too hard. So going forward, as you enter negotiations, how are you going to be able to keep business climate issues on the table when it comes to taxation and other budget issues, and weigh that against the need to provide reasonable social services?
So the average increase in direct expenditures, general fund expenditures by the state government during the first 4 years I was in office was less than 2.8% compared to 4.4% for my predecessors. That's a substantial change. And this year I upped it a little bit to 3.1%, in part because we have to play catch up on OPEB and pension obligations, or we stop making them. Interestingly enough, the Republicans would have us stop making those payments again. That was part of their budget. And by the way, Joe's right to pick on the Democrats. I've done it myself, so that's okay. I'm not picking on you for doing it. But the Republican offering of a budget that put all my cuts back and pretended that there was $650 million of phantom cuts out there that we could make overnight and it wouldn't affect anyone's life was like throwing gasoline on the fire for the Democrats to get ginned up and come out with what they came out with. That's the reality. Is you have to make hard decisions. I was a mayor for 14 years. I had to make hard decisions every single year. Government cannot expand at the rate that we have become used to in the state of Connecticut. And certainly, when we had a governor who entered into a 20-year contract with respect to benefits for state employees, beginning with $1 copay, and a side agreement that we wouldn't fund those long-term obligations until well after he was in office, he didn't save any money. He just spent it in other areas. And I can prove that he didn't save any money because his increasing in spending on a per-year basis was substantially above what we've done here. It is about discipline. So I think I will agree with Joe that this is a very important year. Do we send a signal that we're going to have priorities and that we're going to have and that we're going to fund those priorities, or do we pretend that no matter what happens, we can continue to spend money that somebody tells us we have to spend to quote-unquote maintain current services? Or do we slide back and do we stop funding things like our pension obligations, which I will argue is no savings at all. In fact, you'll go out and find a way to spend the money on something else.
Let me try to focus this a little bit. The legislature seems the conversation to a real choice that I think we're going to see play out in the next couple of weeks, which is which tax goes up and by how much, unless the governor wishes to make some big news tonight and announce an absolute veto of any revenue increase. Feel free, Governor.
Thank you. I think that again, we've got to get a budget done. I believe we can get it done. I believe the budget has to spend substantially less than either the Democrats or the Republicans would argue we could spend on earmarks on pet projects or pretending that you can fund the budget by somehow finding $650 million in savings someplace.
Joe, what's the business community, if, I know you're rooting that there's no tax increase on the business community, but when you look at the possibilities, you both are close observers of the legislature and the Capitol. What is least harmful to your constituency?
Mark, believe me, I'm not trying to dodge your question, but I'm going to answer it this way. I don't think we're at the point yet where people understand that there are alternatives out there. The false choice that is often presented, and I've had this said to me directly, the false choice we often hear, it's either you have these exorbitant tax increases or you slash aid to families with disabled children. And I've heard that, directly, to me. And I said, well, I think that's a false choice. I think we have other alternatives that we can look at. It's a $20+ billion budget if you add everything together, and there's got to be other ways. So we have worked with a group that you may or may not have heard of. It's called the Connecticut Institute for the 21st Century, which I think you founded. Is that correct? Oz founded, and so we've worked closely with them on coming up with some innovative ways to save money. A lot of them are long-term, and that's the problem for the legislature. They've got a June 3rd deadline, so they want dollars right now. But there are some savings immediately, and some over the long term. It looks at corrections. How can you reduce your recidivism rate? The governor's got a second chance proposal, which we support, because we think we've got to find ways to get people back into society in a reasonable way. We work with a group in Florida that has a program where they have a 7% recidivism rate in this one prison program. But we're in the 60s or something here in Connecticut. It's an enormous amount of money that doesn't have to get spent. Looking at long-term care, how can you better balance home care versus nursing home care? Other states do about 75% home care, which is cheaper, and 25% nursing home. We're about flipped here, so we're working with that. Looking at trying to do more with private providers who provide good services but maybe at lower cost than the state does. Looking at the state's IT infrastructure. And importantly, looking at lean, which is a process of improvement started in manufacturing, but now a lot of businesses are doing it, and some of the agencies of the administration are also doing it, that you can deliver your service, a better service, but more cheaply. So let's have that debate. Because if I come out and say, well, we can live with this tax and not that one, then, well, that tax is done, then we're going to do that one. And I don't think we can have that conversation.
What I'm asking all of you to do to a degree is sort of negotiate against yourself in public. And to be fair to you,
I'm not going to do that.
No, that's a very difficult thing. And it's a difficult thing about trying to do reporting on this subject matter, because when I asked the governor that question, you try to pin him down, that's what he would be doing to a degree. So you try to press him to give you parameters and mushy words like that, which he still hasn't gone for. Anyway,
but it's not really trying to dodge. It really is trying to change the debate. Because I think we need to do that. And taxes may come if they come. We hope they don't. But let's have the discussion first. How can we spend dollars more wisely and more efficiently? And again, it's not going to wipe out $1 billion deficit overnight. But we got to make those hard choices now, because the savings grow over time if you can do some of these things differently. So I think that is what we're going to push over the next 3 weeks.
Just to say it a little differently, Mark, we, like the governor back on February 18th, had asked for suggestions in terms of if you had ideas to try to address the budget. We've submitted some of them piggyback off the Connecticut Institute for the 21st Century, as Joe said. There are going to be negotiations. We're all adults. We know this is what's going to happen. In order to get a budget passed either by June 3rd or if we go into special session, there is going to be discussion. I'll piggyback off what Joe said. If confidence is at the heart of private sector expansion, job retention, and capital investment, sending a strong signal through this budget, there's going to be structural changes in the budget going forward, I think is absolutely critical along the lines that Joe said. Otherwise, I think most of us are convinced that we'll be right back in this soup 2 years from now when we're at the next biennial budget, because the same patterns that have developed over the last several years of having our expense base outstrip the revenue components isn't necessarily going to go away unless we make some strong structural reforms along some of the lines that Joe indicated. And I think the governor drawing some lines in the sand on the spending and causing people to think about this is a good starting point for those negotiations.
Listen, I think the Democrats could probably pass their spending plan, but I doubt very much that they could pass their revenue plan. And I think there's a reality set in, and I think they know what would happen if they pass that. So, but I don't think they can. So I think that by, and likewise, I mean, we're kicking the Democrats. You got to remember, the Republicans did not present a reasonable or appropriate budget. I mean, again, $650 million in phantom savings. When they say that, and by the way, the person who negotiated the deal that had the most savings in it of any governor in anyone's lifetime in this room was me 4 years ago, including OPEB funding worth $21 billion in savings. So, I think that, excuse me, $15 billion in savings. So I think that to play, they're both to blame, and they get each other going, and then somebody's got to say, okay, what are your priorities? What are we going to fund in an environment where we're going to have to make some number of hard decisions? What are your priorities? Why are they your priorities? How much can we effectively fund them? Because everything can't be your number one priority.
You left labor out of the equation with your budget proposal. You asked 4 years ago for concessions and you gained them. Are you done with that, or is that fair game to go and ask them if there's going to be, let's say, an income tax increase on one end, to ask them for, I don't know, pay freeze or some other give back?
We have negotiations either ongoing or coming relatively soon with all state employees. We're not going to negotiate those contracts in a public setting, but I'll take my settlements with labor in Connecticut, state employees, and compare it to Rel, compare it to Rowland, compare it to prior governors, and under my administration we've gotten more, including compounding of that more, and I think that frequently gets forgotten. So no one is, and by the way, we are making government smaller, and by the way, we're making it leaner, and by the way, we're investing in technology at an unprecedented amount, and that's allowing us to eliminate even more employees as we go along. So I think labor gives back, and labor will have to continue the process through negotiations with respect to what are appropriate levels of expectation out in the future. Having said that, listen, governors who didn't fund those obligations, I want to go back to this, and this is a mindset that you all can help. When you don't fund an obligation, it's not as if the obligation goes away. In fact, it compounds. Every dollar that did not go in to fund those long-term obligations missed the opportunity to have a return on investment. If you want to be conservative, 6% per year. If you want to be aggressive, of greater than 6%, 7%, 8%, 9%. Every time they didn't put a dollar in, it compounded the difficulties that the state is in, and now what we're trying to do is get them out of it, and I think we're actually making steady progress on that.
Well, I do think that we were too, not complicit, that we had no vote, but we weren't loud enough in saying that was a bad idea, because we knew it was a bad idea at the time, but I don't think we spoke out enough, not funding those pension obligations at the time. So I think there's validity in what the governor says. I will just say that we are not, and I haven't been at all in trying to be partisan in any way. It's just the reality is the Democratic proposals that pass committee and are on a calendar, whereas the Republican ones are never going to see, haven't been voted on, and probably won't be, at least in entirety. So it's just trying to look at what's on the table right now that we're dealing with. So yeah,
but their message was very clear. The governor's a bad guy because he made decisions and hard choices. That's what the Republicans have advertised. The governor is a bad guy because he actually saw what the problem was and took it on. And so in an environment where that's what one party is going to run on, and the other party has to respond, well, listen, if you don't like the cuts to begin with, and the Republicans are saying, hey, put all that money back in, why wouldn't Democrats say put all the money back in? So it in essence licenses bad behavior, I'm not picking on you. I think we're lots of things we're working together on, but that's the reality, and somebody has to come forward and say, and I keep saying, I ask Republicans, I ask them, tell me what your priorities are, and then we can have a discussion about whether we can fund those priorities. But in the absence of you telling me what your priorities are, that means everything's a priority, and we have to fund everything to make everybody happy, and that's not going to happen. Just not going to happen.
So better not?
We're going to get a budget.
That
Hey, Mark, I would just say something that Joe said a minute ago, and this goes back to ancient history, and someday I hope we're all going to sit here and look and have a debate about what to do with surpluses. Those of us who were around here in the late 90s and early part of the last decade witnessed over $5.5 billion of surpluses that were generated, and I would agree. I don't know if this is exactly what Joe said, but I don't think we in the private sector did a good enough job with the Republican administration of insisting that those surpluses be used for what the constitutional amendment provided, namely to fund obligations, pension obligations, or to retire debt. If I remember correctly, the $5.5 billion that some of the analysis that Spencer Kane's done for us, roughly $3.5 billion, really went into the budget for specific programs. And when everybody's rolling in dough, it's so hard to say no. But part of our issue here is what the governor's pointed out, is that that compounding of the obligation, unfunded obligation, is a very nasty hangover that we are really paying for in spades right now. And hats off to the governor for taking some initial leadership here. I know when you put these kinds of ideas out, you get it back. I really believe that we have to move to a defined contribution plan of some kind, because every time you go down a defined benefit route, whether you're in Illinois, whether you're in a municipality, it's so easy for a subsequent administration that doesn't have the fiscal discipline that the governor's indicated to put this off. And it's the next generation that always pays for it. So it's a kind of thing that I believe, we believe, has to change over time. And we hope that as part of this negotiation, some kind of structural reforms along these lines are put in, because I think that's what the private sector, and I know this is the Joe, you do get into negotiating against yourself. I think there's a tolerance for some kind of tax increase if we understand what the tax is going to be used for. And if it's only going to be due to keep funding the same old thing over and over again with no change, including on the property tax, and SB 1 that Senator Looney and Speaker Sharkey put out, it's got good intentions. We think it's going the wrong way in terms of what property tax reform would look like. And so this debate is as much about the future as it is about the reality of getting a budget passed for 16 and 17.
Well, let me ask about property tax. I mean, one of the governor's bedrock principles in a couple difficult budgets was to maintain state aid to cities and towns on the theory that otherwise you're just pushing states' problems downstream and putting more pressure on the property tax, which is more aggressive than the income tax. So how important is it to business climate that the state continue to take as much pressure as possible off the property tax? Even if it means, perhaps, dialing up the top rate on the income tax from 6.7 to 6.99, which is what they're talking about.
I'll give it first crack at this. I go back and go ahead.
But it's not 6.99, because then there's another new 2%.
It's a super charge on the
Right, right.
So just a quick response, Mark. I think you can't ignore unfunded mandates, which are part of the property tax situation, and that also can send some strong negative signals to the private sector. The idea that the bill, and I haven't read it, so I may be misstating it, but the idea that they're going to give some relief on the on education funding by not mandating that giving some flexibility in terms of being able to evaluate whether your enrollment has changed, I think is a modest step in the right direction. But our concern is there's no incentives for the towns to come together and share services unless they do it on their own. We've said there needs to be a carrot and stick here, and one of the things we put forward, why not have 100% of the municipal, your point about the governor being firm on making sure the municipalities are held harmless, take a percentage of that and say you get 90% of what you got last year, but this 10% you only get if there's some combination of shared services around COGS or anything else. I think there has to be some motivation to all of us who should care deeply about the 169 towns and home rule. You're not going to see mergers of towns, but I think there's a way that the state can become creative with the use of those monies to get the towns to act in a more cooperative and efficient way.
I mean, in my mind, this all comes down ultimately to what can we do to create greater economic vitality and economic growth in Connecticut, because that's where your dollars come from. The surpluses that Oz talked about was because our economy, coming out of that really bad recession in the late 80s, early 90s, we lost 165,000 jobs. In a small state like Connecticut, that is a lot of jobs. But then after that, we had the tax reform, we had the spending cap come in, we reformed workers' comp, unemployment comp, made some changes to small business health care. And then it's, Connecticut's a small state, so we're not our own economy. We're on part of the technology boom, but we had surpluses because we were positioned to grow as the rest of the nation grew. So unless we really focus, in my belief, on what is going to incent more investment and growth, that talent or the confidence that Oz talked about earlier, that to me is the only way you're really going to solve your problem. If you take from one person or one group of taxpayers to try to help out another group of taxpayers, that's not creating anything. That's maybe relieving somebody's burden, but ultimately you may be slowing down your growth. And nobody likes to defend the people at the upper income levels, but those are people that invest a lot in the state, they create jobs, they contribute a lot to their communities and to charities, and it's easy, they're very, very mobile. So I think we have to be careful. And maybe it doesn't sound like going 6.7 to 6.99, but and then the 2% on top of that for capital gains. I don't think that's a good decision for the state of Connecticut, with the hopes that maybe you'll get a little property tax relief at the end of the day. I don't see how that instills more investment or confidence or helps us attract capital or talent into Connecticut, which is what we need.
Governor, you have to weigh in sort of social justice, economic justice issues with having a good business climate. You were elected with the help of the Working Families Party, you supported minimum wage increases, paid sick days.
I do.
Your tax department, its tax incident study said that people who made, households earning $48,000 and under, their effective tax rate, when you include everything, sales, property, income, is 23%. So, and at the top end, it's 6-point-something%.
So, no, again, that's your top income tax rate. You're not paying 23% income tax rate at 48.
No, not at all.
Right.
It's overall.
So then you can't then include property tax in one calculation and not include it in another. And so I mean there are those differences. And if you make less than $250,000, for instance, we're not doing clawback. We do clawback above that number. So I mean let's get it all out there. Let me get one other.
I just want to be clear, it was an apples to apples number, 23% effective rate under 50 grand essentially, and then it quickly drops to 12% and goes down as you go up the income level.
And we have one county in the state that pays almost 50% of all tax revenue to the state. And it doesn't represent 50% of the population. So I mean, I think that you have to balance the mobility of jobs, the mobility of the individuals and decisions that are being made. And the reality is we have seen 75,000 jobs grow in the last 4 years. We did see our best job numbers since 1998. A lot of years between 1998 and last year. We had our best job numbers last year. That's the reality of what we've accomplished in a relatively short period of time. But I do want to clarify one thing. There was no $5.5 billion surplus. Connecticut's never had a surplus during that period of time because that surplus was made by not funding long-term obligations. So there was never a surplus. The only surplus that has existed is the $518 million that we set aside while we were fully funding our obligations. There was none, and what that did was to encourage government at all levels, and Republicans and Democrats, to spend money that they didn't actually have. That's what happened. And that's not an easy set of habits to break for anybody, including Republicans, who wanted to undo every cut that I made in the budget. So this is all about trying to, get people to move in an appropriate direction. I think my budget was better than the Republican budget. I think my budget was better than the Democrats' budget. I think my budget is the least realistic and maintains a low level of growth in total expenditures, actually slightly higher than what I've done in the past, but in part because we have to make these relatively, let's put it this way, of the 3.1% increase, 1% of that is additional pension obligation contributions. I could be Joni Rell or John Rowland. Let's take that 1% out. Let's just do it. Let's pass a budget that doesn't fund the pensions. It worked for them. Why shouldn't it work for us? The reality is next year that money will get spent on something else. Or this year it will get spent on something else. So putting in generally accepted accounting principles, whether we're 96% compliant or 100% compliant, is better than not complying at all and not even acknowledging that they exist. So we are, on a long-term basis, GAAP compliant, on a long-term basis fulfilling our legal obligations with respect to funding those long-term obligations. Those are the right things to do. But then, we've created some really good programs. We're supporting manufacturing in the state of Connecticut. We had no support for manufacturing. Now, we have a new relationship with United Technologies, a company that, for all intents and purposes, had threatened to leave the state 6 years ago. Right? They're now going to make massive new investments in our state. They're going to have more engines being built in Connecticut within probably at this point 12 months than at any time since 1983. And they have a supply chain independent of their own number of employees in the state, which has remained relatively consistent, although at higher income. As they displace manufacturing for engineering in some cases. A supply chain of 75,000 additional individuals. That's pretty good. And then helping that 75,000 person supply chain gear up so that they can make twice as many of what they were previously making, ultimately having to make 3 times of that is pretty exciting stuff. And I think bodes well for our long-term success within aerospace. By the way, we are the second most concentrated in aerospace of all 50 states. I don't know where that crazy ranking came from. And we're, we can shift a little bit. It's Kansas, it's Washington, and it's us when it comes to concentration in aerospace. And if you're going to build something, building engines and building submarines are not bad high-value items to be manufactured. But we have a $100 million plan to modernize manufacturing in the state of Connecticut. Small Business Express program. We had no tools in the toolbox for small businesses when I became governor. We created a new program that's already assisted 1,395 small businesses to employ an additional almost let's call it round out number, 5,000 additional employees, retaining 14,000 jobs that previously existed, with a success record many, many times greater than the Commerce Department and on par with what private banks are doing or better. These are new tools that have been created that did not exist before, and I think that are underappreciated in some of those business rankings as well. In the budget I proposed, I called for the elimination of effectively the small business tax, which is $375. I would do away with it. After having slashed it in half in my first budget year, when we had the largest per capita deficit in the nation. So we are mindful of some of the changes that we have to make with respect to taxing policy.
While you're still trying to figure out the next budget, the next general fund budget, Oz and a bunch of other folks have been asked by you to come up with a funding mechanism to support borrowing that would ramp up over biennium to $1.4 billion, I guess, in 5 years, and then jump up to $3 billion. I'm trying to avoid using a $100 billion investment over 30 years, because I think most of us just can't comprehend that. So, Oz and Joe, if there's a bad outcome on taxes by June 3rd, what does the business community do as far as stepping up and supporting a new revenue source or sources to support not only the governor's vision for the transportation infrastructure, but also to continue just regular transportation spending, because the special transportation fund is going to go broke by 2018 or 2017. Go ahead.
I've been very clear with legislators. I mentioned it to the governor's chief of staff when I met with him, that if this budget comes out bad on the tax side, it's going to be extremely difficult for us to go back to our members and say, okay, you just got whacked on sales tax and income taxes and corporate taxes, but now you got to pony up for $100 billion or whatever the number is for transportation. It's going to be extremely difficult to do that. I had a long discussion with our board just about 2 weeks ago, and we discussed that. And we had Jim Redeker at our board meeting, Commissioner of the Department of Transportation. We've had him a couple times in different venues to talk about this. As I said at the very top, I think that's a big driver, pardon the pun, of transportation investment is the economic aspects of it. I mean, the numbers down, particularly along I-95 with the delays and the cost of that, it's in the billions of dollars annually. So we have been supportive. It's been part of our agenda forever. It's part of the 2517 agenda to upgrade our infrastructure. But we're going to have to take a serious look at, how can we still be competitive from a cost standpoint if we're going to have major tax increases and then have to fund transportation on top of that. I don't have an answer for you right now, but it's a serious, serious concern.
A couple of quick things, Mark. First of all, applaud the governor for putting this on the agenda. This has been talked about with very little action over the last 20 years. Fully agree with Joe's comment on additional taxes. It goes back to the governor's point on priorities, and we hope in the negotiations that go forward, that continue over the next 3 weeks or into a special session, that everybody understands Joe's point that whatever tax increases are not going to have to be taken into account. You have to take this transportation focus into account. So we're highly aligned with that. Cam Staples is the gentleman, former state legislature and chair of the finance committee, whom the governor appointed to chair this. And the first meeting, one of the first points several of us made is understanding that whatever recommendations we make have to be sensitive to the political realities in which we're making them. Recommendations, even if the recommendations don't take effect for 2 more fiscal years, which is essentially where I think we will come out. The governor has said he will support a constitutional amendment. We think it's critical in this session that there be a piece of legislation passed that secures the current special transportation fund now for this biennium, that the gasoline and gross receipts tax that fund that are used only for transportation purposes over the next 2 years, and that as part of this process for whatever the funding sources are, that there be a constitutional amendment put before the people of this state to secure that lockbox over the long haul. We've also made a recommendation. I think one of the things the governor deserves a lot of credit for, particularly in this region, is the establishment of the Connecticut Airport Authority, which was part of his first package. The fact that we now have the 6 state airports, especially Bradley, pulled out from under the direct oversight of DOT, I think has given the kind of leverage that they need, that the airport management needs to recruit additional flights. I think that's a step. Our parallel recommendation, which is fraught with all kinds of issues because it's not as clean as the airport authority, that having some kind of transportation authority working in conjunction with DOT, with private sector participation, we think would be a step in the right direction. So it's going to be critical that we understand Joe's point on the overall context of the recommendations, the political reality, whatever this current budget is, and then there has to be a strong message sent to all the citizens in the private sector that whatever the funding sources are, they are going to be secured for transportation.
Let me just say that I agree with the points that were made, both with respect to what this budget looks like and the implications for transportation on a long-term basis, and the lockbox. And I think we can get the lockbox done this year legislatively with no override of at least existing funds or any funds that would go into the fund. Listen, the legislature can always undo things with respect to what goes in there, but no dollar should ever come out for any purpose other than transportation. We've been very clear and we'll hold fast to that. I think on a long-term basis, on the infrastructure side, that transportation is terribly important for Connecticut. When your congestion cost is 40 hours a week on average, and I would argue in Fairfield County it's probably closer to 3 weeks on average per employee, that comes at a cost. It's about $4.2 billion. If we could just make it over the next 12 years, if we could cut congestion costs in half, there's $2 billion right there. And it's not as if we save money by underinvesting in transportation. Quite frankly, some of the things that we're going to undertake are going to be more expensive this decade than they would have been last decade versus what they would have been the decade before. It's like the guy who doesn't, fix his roof until all of the beams are rotted. It gets a lot more expensive. And yeah, it's a big vision, but we have a big problem. I think one of the good things is the early investments tend to be will be able to be made in mass transit much more rapidly than they can on some of the other projects because we control those situations better. One of my, but I got beat up for the last 4 years, probably by some people in this room, about Connecticut Fast Track. But lo and behold, we made a decision, we built it and we already have numbers that we didn't expect to have until the end of the year, and at best. And you know what? It's good to have a win. It's good to be able to show that you can build a project on time, under budget, and have it meet expectations. And it's the kind of plus that I think that the corporate community should look to when it decides what to do on supporting an overall transportation investment package, which I believe they are supportive of, but we're going to need a big push.
Governor, I have to say that for you, that was a subtle nudge as the business community to stay on board instead of a broadside.
No, listen, I've made, some of the points that were just made, I've made in private conversations with members, with leadership of the legislature. I think that we need to demonstrate that, well, yeah, I keep arguing, I keep asking people what their priorities are. One of my priorities is transportation. There, you have them. Right, now I want to know what your priorities are.
Let me ask about something that grows out of this, which is something that was touched on earlier a little bit, but the whole question of confidence, both confidence in the business community of knowing what's coming, confidence in taxpayers at large. When people talk about a massive investment in lock boxes, I believe Joe Brennan testified yesterday at length complaining about taxes that were supposed to sunset, that the sun never seems to go down. So in this, let's keep it to this budget. As you go forward on this budget, how do you do that? How do you start to build that confidence that this is going to unfold when it comes to all this transportation funding the way it's planned and the way you're promising it will unfold?
Well, let me, just because, I don't shy away from issues. On the corporate side, even including the surcharge, which applies to companies over $50 million, if I remember correctly, in revenue, we still have the second lowest effective corporate tax rate in America, even including that. So, quite frankly, I have suggested that become permanent. I've said that. Because if you could still be the second lowest in America, the only state lower is North Carolina, with that surcharge, then maybe, and you're more reliant on property taxes, or you're the top three reliant on property taxes of all 50 states, maybe you need to make some correction there. So I've said that before. On the other hand, I think some of the proposals that are contained in the package that the Democrats put forward, or in the non-package that the Republicans put forward, because they didn't honestly tell you how they were going to pay for putting all the money back in the budget that the bad governor made cuts to. I think that we have to have a serious discussion about those things, and I'm certainly prepared. I'm not shy. I mean, I'm here. I got a job for a little over 3.5 years. I like to argue these issues to some sort of conclusion. At the same time that I take a systemic approach year after year after year to making progress on what I've told everybody for many years my priorities were.
I think confidence is a difficult thing to judge. Our membership is so large and broad that, some people think the sky is falling and there's nothing we can do to fix it. Other people are much more optimistic, and there's a lot in the middle. So it's trying to, to figure out, for the what we call economic-based industries, for advanced manufacturing, for biopharmaceutical, for financial services and insurance, the main drivers of our economy. What do you need to do to instill confidence in those people? Because so many of the small businesses rely on those larger companies. The governor pointed out, hundreds of companies just in one large company supply chain. So trying to do that is a difficult task. I will, criticize one of the proposals that the governor had earlier this year, and it goes to that confidence, and that was the reduction in the value of tax credits. 70% of liability going down to 35% of liability. That's the kind of thing that doesn't instill confidence, because then it's a moving target. Now the Democrats are saying 50%. So if you're making investments, and I hear this from companies, we're not going to rely on that because we don't know what it's going to be by the time we go to take those credits. So I think if we can maintain what we have on the books as much as possible, and as difficult as it might be to limit, I won't go as far as saying eliminate any tax increases, but at least limit those as much as possible, and then do a lot of the longer term things that we had talked about and Oz had talked about around the spending cap. fortifying that to make sure it has real teeth going forward, and then making all the kind of long-term budget reforms. If you can go back to the business community and say, okay, we've learned our lesson, we're doing things differently. The governor pointed out all the things that he's done differently in the time he's been in office, but the legislature is listening to our message, and everybody agrees that we really need to focus on growth if we're going to be successful. I think that will begin to instill some of that confidence. But you got to do it year after year after year and maintain your commitments.
I forgot your question, Mark, so I'll just make a statement. Seriously, one of the things that we talk about, people like Joe and me, we get paid by people like you to go up to the Capitol and make the arguments, work with the governor's staff. I can't underscore enough how important it is for all of you to take that same initiative with your state senator and state rep. I'm preaching to the choir. Obviously, you wouldn't be here if you didn't want to listen to this subject, you didn't have an interest in it. We've been urging, with the private sector, we're all in this together, and the private sector has to communicate in many ways just beyond CBIA and the MetroHartford Alliance. We've certainly encouraged many of the larger employers to make sure they're not only talking to the governor with some of their concerns, but talking directly to leadership, and in some cases directly to whoever represents them in their hometown. We think that's critical. Give Brett a lot of credit for hosting these kind of forums. We partnered with him and Jim Smith down at Webster Bank to put on a series of forums on this issue. But when you get right down to it, we can go up and talk to legislators, we can talk to leadership. It's nowhere near as effective if people like you are talking to your representatives and senators and underscoring your concerns about a particular tax or a particular spending cut that's of value to you. If you just took the constitutional spending cap and you think that's important, having legislators hear that from Kurt Cameron and others in here is far more effective than any kind of message or letter that Oz Griebel or Joe Brennan can ever write or communicate. So we're delighted you're here, and we hope you communicate what you learned here tonight to your friends, your neighbors, and your colleagues, and over these next 3 weeks, make your voice heard.
Just real quickly, then we'll give you the final word. All of us do this a lot, go around the state and speak. I've never done it at a brewery before, so I want to thank Kurt and all the folks at Hooker. This was really cool being able to do this.
So let me just say this with respect to the packages. I've been critical of both the Republican package and the Democratic package, and I certainly understand your criticism with respect to some of the adjustments that we would make. But I do want to point out that we banked those. We didn't take them away, we delayed them as opposed. But I understand the point you're making. In other administrations, they've actually taken them away and not banked them. We made that adjustment. But I also understood that when we presented the budget, there were going to be some number of changes in the budgetary process. I do think that the depth and the size of the reach on the tax side of at least one of the two budget proposals is far more dangerous for some business interests than anything that I've talked about doing or has been done in a long time. So when you say to a manufacturer that you're going to apply a sales tax every step of the manufacturing process, understanding that they're not internally making many of those products, that can quickly turn into a $40 million or $50 million additional obligation on the tax side, which would pale in comparison to, say, a $10 million delay in that same year of your ability to use a previously earned tax credit, delaying it by a year. So you never actually lose the $10 million and it gets kicked down the road.
We don't like that one either.
But you know, listen, we got to make choices. I keep saying that, and that everything is your number one priority. Doesn't work in the legislature, and it doesn't work when business interests are expressing themselves either. So we got to be in this together. We got to work together. I think we actually have a good working relationship. So I want to with both of your organizations. And I think that one other point on it. The glass that could never be more than half empty was than a lot of other places. And interestingly enough, people follow legislative action a lot more here than they do in New York State, the state that I lived in. And if you ask somebody in New York or in Albany what's going on at the Capitol, they'll look at you with a blank stare. This is, we don't have the Patriots, we have the legislature. And we watch it play every day. It's in essentially.
We wanted to pay the taxes, that's what we wanted to do.
Did you just accuse the legislature of cheating?
Listen, the heaviest football players have been sitting on footballs for a long time. So, Deflategate is not new. I got news for you. You got your 350-pound lineman sitting on a ball. You'd be amazed at what happens to him. And I'm not defending Brady or the Patriots. But I just think that we tend to be very hard on ourselves, particularly during these legislative sessions. I predict that we're going to come out of this better than it appears right now, that we'll get a budget done, I think before, if not shortly thereafter, that there's enough room. As I said, I think the legislature could run its spending package and get it passed tomorrow. I think they have no chance of getting their tax package passed, which means you then have to go back and do another spending package if left to their own devices. I'm hopeful that we're going to get a deal that will allow us to have even better growth numbers in employment this year than we had last year, and last year was our best year since 1998. We're making progress.
Being respectful of everybody's time, we do actually have time for 2 quick questions if anybody in the audience has a question.
A lot of great ideas here. We came up from Madison, Connecticut, and I'm a registered independent, so I recognize the courage you've had in promoting education reform and some really tough cuts. But having been a rating agency analyst and a banker, but also the daughter of a very elderly mother who's a teacher here, I write her checks. And after you proposed your very aggressive bill, which I was up there lobbying to support, her benefits didn't get cut. In fact, her health benefits are very, very rich. If you look back at what Texas is now at the top of the state, great place to do business state list, versus Connecticut, I'd say we have a lot in common. What Texas did back in the 80s when they found themselves so concentrated in oil is they tried to figure out how to make their state economy more diversified. So I was wondering, given the parties seem to be fighting with each other, is there any move to try to develop something that they work together to make long-term, sustainable, improvable changes in the state that would make the rating agencies a lot happier?
That's a lot to respond to, so how do I take it on? It's highly unlikely that we can make effective changes to a current retiree's benefits after the date of retirement. So it's a matter of law. So that's the reality. And in fact, with a different state constitution, but every justice of the Illinois Constitution of the Supreme Court ruled that you couldn't do that in that state. With respect to future benefits, we have changed those future benefits. People will work substantially longer in Connecticut as a result of the changes that we made. With respect to OPEB benefits, when I became governor, the only people contributing anything at all to post-employment benefits, insurance, was anyone hired after 2009. I was the only guy hired after 2009 when I became governor. Now every employee contributes to that. So I think that there's a misconception that we haven't made some of the changes. You could argue they go further, but I will tell you that we've made much greater changes than Rhode Island. We've made much greater changes than New Jersey. The difference between us and New Jersey is when we made the changes, we also then properly funded the obligation, which is in and of itself is a defense mechanism to people spending the money in some other way. We're always looking for ways to save money. We've got to do it within the law and within the Constitution, and frequently we have to do it around the bargaining table at this point. Listen, one of my wonderful predecessors acted with some amount of malice, and because he didn't get what he wanted. And my administration is going to have to pay a $100 million bill, actually over that, effectively, for what John Rowland did in improperly laying people off. That could have been $360 million potentially. So we got to dot our I's and cross our T's, and every once in a while we're going to make a mistake, but hopefully we don't ever make a $360 million mistake.
Sir.
Charles Reese, I'm also from Madison, Connecticut.
You actually carpool.
Probably came from different
We're
places.
huge in Madison.
That's right. I guess I have some disappointment in vocabulary. I really came here thinking business environment, and I've been a little bit taken back what I've heard. To me, that's not a budget fight, and I agree we are going to get the budget solved. So much of the conversation comes, in Connecticut, I find, comes to large corporations. My background's almost totally in high tech. And I look at what's come out in this tax package in terms of taxing capital gains when we really need private investment to grow. Pass-through, most of these organizations are pass-through organizations. We have R&D tax credits. They can't use them. What do you say to a young person with a startup? Why should they come to Connecticut?
Well, it's an area that we've actually had more success in the last 2 years than at any time in a long time. In part because we created a whole series of tools, not the least of which is Connecticut Innovations increasing its investment in the small startups, along with our investment in the Small Business Express program, and that's particularly to IT or intellectual property startups. I was just at a business that is going from 19 to 60 people literally overnight that we've invested in using both of those tools. And they believe that they'll hit their 5-year target of 85 total employment probably sometime in the next 12 months when they wouldn't otherwise, under their agreements with us, be obligated to reach that for another 4 years. So I think we've created a new tool set. That tool set did not exist in but there's another point, and you're not so far from Yale. I'll never forget a dinner I had in the Haven one of the times I was running for governor. I think it was the first successful campaign. A professor at Yale was telling me about how he moved he left MIT for a new position at Yale, and he brought a bunch of people with him. And I said, well, what's the biggest difference between being here in Connecticut and being in Massachusetts? And this is a systemic problem. He said, well, when I was in Massachusetts at MIT, somebody knocked on my door almost every week to ask what I was doing that they could invest in. And a lot of that was by the university itself or its personnel. We need to create that kind of environment in Connecticut. Yale didn't do it. Now, I think the past president of Yale and the current president of Yale have been moving them in that direction, but they didn't do it. We were behind for a number of reasons in reaching out to the kinds of businesses that you're talking about. But we've been able to beat back folks with investments from moving to Boston, moving to out to California, or moving to Brooklyn. And in fact, we're moving people from other states into our state, particularly, and you mentioned this in your I loved the things you reeled off on, which are anchors of our economy in Connecticut, where we have created an entirely new tool set, bioscience, something that we were underinvested in, life sciences in general, IT as well, and really startup. So angel investing, because of changes that we made in state government, we were one of the top angel investors in the country last year, ranked in the top 10. That did not exist before, and that was largely as a result of a government program, which presumably you would support.
I'm sorry, can we squeeze one more question in? I'm not sure if it came from Madison, but...
It's not from Madison, it's from Windsor.
But if we could squeeze one in, we appreciate it, thank you.
Thank you. I'm not from Madison, I'm from Windsor, Connecticut. And I have 2 comments. One comment, one question. First, I really applaud the concept of property tax reform that you've discussed. And I'd like to see at some point in the future some very meaningful property tax reform legislation being put forward with the governor's office working with the legislature. And along the lines that Oz talked about, with municipalities working together and sharing services, I think that's the future. Whether, you hate to say county government in the state, but moving more towards a county government form for sharing services and property taxes would be terrific. That's my comment. I'm staring here from northern Connecticut, looking at, come visit Hooker Brewery at Mohegan Sun. I'd like to know your perspectives on growing revenue and growing jobs, and whether or not a casino north of Hartford would add to jobs and revenues and how that factors into the budget. Oz put together a terrific program at the MetroHartford Alliance a couple weeks ago, and it really stirs a good discussion that we hear a lot about. So I'd like to know how that fits into the budget.
I've not built any assumptions in the budget on whether there'll be more casinos or more gaming or not. I will tell you that we've probably lost over the last 4 years in excess of 10,000 jobs, maybe as many as 12,000 jobs, direct and indirect, because of the additional competition that the 2 casinos are facing in our state from out-of-state gaming, most particularly in New York State, Rhode Island, elsewhere in New England, and obviously the biggest threat being Massachusetts. So what the state legislature ultimately decides to do needs to be about jobs, not about gaming itself. And listen, I've said this before, I liked America better when there was only one place you could go and invest your money that way. Now gaming has become ubiquitous. But I don't think we can afford to sit in our state and say, well, it's ubiquitous elsewhere, let's send our jobs there, unless that's a definitive, thought-out process that people say, okay, the 2 casinos that still are employing a lot of people will continue to lose those jobs, which they will. They're going to face more and more competition. You're going to have 6, you're going to have at least 3 full-service facilities in Massachusetts with an additional 6 facilities, smaller facilities in the state for gaming. That's big competition in one of our biggest marketplaces. You have it in New York City already. You have it elsewhere in New York State where we were getting all the votes, and you have more outlets in Rhode Island. I don't know. You tell me whether you want us to compete or not. But it's not. There's no assumption in my budget that we're going to do that. And by the way, listen. You don't have to feel sorry for me. This is not woe is me. But we've had to manage that rather rapid decline, not just of those jobs that were at the casinos, direct and indirect, but the loss of that revenue. And we've done so, without belly aching a whole lot. And people forget that we've had to do that. That's what we've done. You want to know why we haven't recovered all of the jobs lost in the Great Recession? It's because of the loss of jobs in the eastern part of the state due to the 2 casinos downsizing. That's the sole difference.
I want to thank Governor Malloy, Joe Brennan, Oz Griebel for their time. Of course, our very own Mark Pagerakis. Couple quick notes. Brewery tour. I want to thank Kurt Cameron for actually hosting this tonight. If you are interested in a brewery tour, please see him over there. I want to thank Oz Griebel, MetroHartford Alliance, Joe Brennan, CBIA, have been fantastic partners. Bob Gunther from Webster Bank have supported the Connecticut Mirror. I want to thank everybody in this room for supporting the Connecticut Mirror. We have more journalists covering politics of capital than any other news organization in the state. We're the only news organization with a reporter in DC. We're also a non-profit news organization, which means that you drank your donation today, so thanks for supporting us. ctmirror.org, thank you all for coming out tonight.